So our group has decided to take the route of explaining the purpose of pivot tables. And typically this is something that is done in Excel, but we are going to take it to Google Sheets today. So pivot tables typically are used to not only simplify a bunch of data, especially meaningless data, but really help you draw conclusions and view the data from different perspectives and take away from that. So the first and most important step of a pivot table is really having the correct data, and more importantly having the data laid out correctly so that your pivot table is able to read it. So let's move on to this first sheet. Typically when you see data, it looks similar to this. You'll see products, and you'll see it sorted out in some sense, typically with numbers, and then you'll see totals. So here we have data, we have how many shirts, and then how many that we sold in the Western region, and the totals. And it looks pretty detailed. You know, what more information could you need? If you added more, it would be hard to read. You wouldn't know the purpose behind it and what you're really trying to get out of it. So it makes sense for some. However, if you really want to get that different perspective and to draw bigger conclusions and to move on with your data, it's important to insert it in a way where the pivot table will be able to read it, and essentially that's similar to this. So you have all these categories up at the top. The biggest thing with pivot table data and getting it entered is having each identical item on its own. So you want to have any shirt or any pair of pants or any headband that you've sold, it needs to have its own order ID number. And typically, it does. You just don't insert that data into your graphs and into your spreadsheets because you don't think that you need it and it just is too much to look at. So in this instance, we have our first order number was a shirt. You can put that under a category, the amount that was paid, the date it was bought, and the region it was purchased in. And you can continue this list down for however many or whatever you are trying to put into this table. So a lot of people do this with employees or inventory and things like that. So here we have what it would look like finalized. You can see your order ID, the product, category, amount, date, and the region. So with this data, you can already see so many more things that you weren't able to see back here in this first spreadsheet. This is a little bit more normal. This is something that we're used to seeing. However, when you bring in all this data, it looks confusing. What do you look at? What are you trying to get? What conclusion are you supposed to get out of it? But that's where the pivot table comes in. So we're going to go on further, and Jackie's going to explain to you, once you have your data all spread out into different order ID numbers or each individual employee and things like that, there's so much you can do and so many ways to interpret it. So I'm going to hand it over to Jackie, and she will explain how to turn this set of data into.
Once all of the data has been entered into an Excel spreadsheet, you are ready to create the pivot table. Creating a pivot table will be useful in this scenario because there's a lot of data that is hard to read. Pivot tables allow you to find the information you are looking for a lot quicker. In this example, we see the data set that includes the order ID, product, category, amount, date, and region. We're going to want to select this data in order to create the pivot table. There are two ways you can select all of the data. The first being clicking on the corner of the datasheet, which will highlight the whole workbook. This makes it a lot easier when there are huge amounts of data that you can't grab really quickly. For this example, we can click on cell A1 and drag until all of the cells are highlighted. Once that is complete, we will now go to the Data tab, click on Pivot Table, and this will then create the pivot table and move to a new sheet in the workbook. So here is the data sheet, and we have created a pivot table. Anna will now explain how to actually pivot the data.
As Jackie explained, we have a data set and pivot table ready to go. Now we can begin pulling data to help discover different trends and patterns. The reason pivot tables are named as such is because you can pivot or rearrange data quickly. As an example, we are going to find the sum amount for each product. To do this, we can simply change the requirements that Google Sheets is pulling from on the left-hand side by using rows and values. So to rows, we're going to add product, and values, we're going to add amount. This gives us the sum amount per product. What's really nice about pivot tables is that they allow for exploring different values easily. For example, here we are examining the sum amount for each product, but what if we wanted to view the sum amount for each category? To change the requirements, simply click the X to stop the program from pulling the product information. Next, click Add under Rows and choose Category. The table will adjust or pivot to show the new data. We can also add columns to specify data even further. For example, if we add the data column, the pivot table changes to reflect the sum amount for each category on each day. I'm going to redo that. The whole thing, no, just that section. Redo here. We can also add columns to specify data even further. For example, if we add the date column, the pivot table changes to reflect the sum amount for each category on each day. Because we added the date column, the pivot table lists the sum amount per category per day. On March 17th, there was a total of $1,873 purchased in the clothing category, which also happens to be the total amount purchased for the day. You can also scroll over to the very end of the table to still see the grand totals per category.
Once we've created the pivot table based on the data, we can go forward with creating a filter. For the purpose of showing the filter, I've created a pivot table based on the dates we sold items and the amount of the items we have sold on those dates. So if I want to take it a step further and look at what items we sold and their amounts, I can add a filter to the pivot table by choosing the category and dragging that into the filter. You can populate this pivot table builder box by clicking on the pivot table. Then that should populate the filter on top of the pivot table, and I can click on it and select which items I'd like to look at. So first I'm looking at the clothing, and then the hair products, and then the makeup. And what I can see from this is that the clothing was the most popular item sold from March 17th through April 2nd. And a benefit of having a filter on your pivot table is that you can quickly pull individual information without taking that away from the overall pivot table.
Feature that the actual Excel program has that Google Sheets does not have is the ability to make a pivot chart. Basically what this is basically just like an interactive chart that plays off your pivot table. So to do that, you're going to want to select your data. You can either select it like this, or if you have a ton of data, it's easiest to just hit Control A, and then you want to go to the Insert tab. Under the Insert tab, you'll see the Pivot Table button and the Pivot Chart button. What I'm going to do first is put it into a pivot table, just to play off of what we have already done so far. So all of our data selected, we're going to go ahead and hit OK. It brings us to a new sheet. So I'm just going to put in here category and the value of the amount spent. So if we're looking in here, I'm taking the dollar amount and what category it was spent in. So just something really simple. You can make it whatever you want to try and figure out the different types of ways you can play with it. So once I have this, I can just click anywhere in the pivot table, and then to make the pivot chart, just simply hit pivot chart. Pops up like that. I personally like to right click, and then you can do move chart, and I like to move it to a new sheet. When you do this, it ends up taking the whole area, so it's easiest to see what's going on. Now, to manipulate the pivot chart, you can either go back to your pivot table and add in other different categories in here. It really depends on what you're looking for. We could look more specifically at the products instead of the category to see how much was spent on each, and then automatically changing the pivot chart data changes your graph, and that automatically refreshes. Every now and then you'll get some drop-down filters. It just really depends on what kind of data you have, if you're using Mac OS or if you're using Windows, but all in all, the process is the same. And then you can go ahead with editing your chart how you normally would. You can change the color of your chart if you would like to. But this is just a different way to break down your data from the pivot table to make it more visual, and some people prefer that.